Last session of the day, we're going to have a roundtable discussion. We have 4 speakers here. Each is going to speak under the heading 5-point plan for Ireland.
We have worked with these 3 investors. They're quite different. You probably recognize Blackstone as being one of the biggest private equity and alternative investment managers in the world, and they've put a lot of money into Ireland. The same is true of Starwood. And Killeen2 Benson Investors used to be KBC Investors, and they were acquired recently by an international group as well. Blackstone are really interesting to me because their leader, Stephen Schwarzman, has a really, really top record of selecting destinations for investment and sectors and many other things. And he believes firmly that 70% of his investment decision when selecting a geography, certainly, or a location, comes down to human capital, and about 15% comes down to his interpretation of the value of the social capital in that country. Starwood, I'd say, are a little bit more commercial. All of them want the returns. They don't really consider these things. They're common in one respect. They've both made big investments here. They've both been very successful here, but they've had completely different ways of going about it. Killeen2 Benson were acquired by somebody who's got permanent capital, which differs completely from the way that Blackstone and Starwood operate. And they, again, put great emphasis in they're buying effectively an operating business here, not just investments which are going to turn. But what's interesting about Schwarzman and a lot of these guys is that although they really recognize the value of this capital, they're not willing to pay taxes if they can possibly avoid it. And I think that's really an opportunity in a way that I'll describe later. They're all relevant to us here in Ireland. Taking a practical example of the sort of work we do, and I know this is an area that got some coverage earlier in the day. There are lots of different ways of supplying social housing. We came across Focus Ireland about 3 years ago. One of my colleagues was taken by the notion that we could actually use the Focus Ireland platform as a means for delivering an investment product for our clients. And so he worked on it, and he came up with something which has been accepted and promoted by the Department of the Environment. And it works very simply that, broadly speaking, if the state, through the department, puts in approximately 23% of the value of the fund, that we can raise a bond against that of the balance of 77%, and we can then get a return through rents to those bondholders of, over the life, a 30-year life, approximately 6% of the on an annual basis, an IRR of 6%. And there's also, a very cherished, it has a characteristic, very cherished characteristic, which is that it has an index link feature. But perhaps the most beautiful thing about this structure is that it's the estate which we acquire, the 220 houses in that case, for a 35 million fund, would remain at the end of the life with Focus as part of their enlarged estate. And Focus Ireland's reward would be for providing the management of that estate for the 30 years, and also for putting their existing estate up as collateral to raise the money. So very neat. Our investors get a return. It suits them in terms of long-term asset. And you might ask, why in 3 years hasn't it happened? And it hasn't happened because, frankly, we've been getting in our way through some of the agencies that Colin might have been talking about earlier, and also through some of the intergovernmental and departmental issues. But we are at a happy point now, I think, where once ISIF has been formed, officially, I think they've signaled to us that they're very, very seriously going to consider doing this transaction. And I suppose 35 million mightn't knock you off the seat, and it shouldn't, because it's not enough, but it's a step in the right direction. And by our calculations, within 5 years, we could grow this market to about 400 million in terms of, with very, very keen assumptions. and that would be approximate to some of the markets like the UK and Holland on a pro rata basis. Tying these things together is really kind of, something that Sean and I talked about when we met for coffee about 6 weeks ago, and he wanted me to do this, and I suppose it may sound a little odd coming from here, but we certainly recognise the importance of, as I said, some of these big investors, their departure point is that they want to see, and they will invest much more easily in countries and markets where they have, strong social capital and human capital values, but they don't seem to want to pay those taxes, which is the odd thing in my considering it. So I really feel the opportunity lies in repositioning that whole concept of tax completely. We could do it at a national level. We've got to remember that 95% of us taxpayers are probably compliant, and maybe 95% of all taxpayers are taking corporates as well are compliant, as to perhaps 98% of their tax bill. But it's the other 5% if I can pick that number at random without any academic backing at all, that has generally got the role model position, and I feel that there's we have to reposition tax to those role models, and I take a few examples of repositioning, and clearly a lot easier in repositioning tax is something that people want to do, but if I think of the Wellington boot, the smelly wellies, I mean that would have been its image for many years of fellas standing in fields looking at wild animals, whereas today the Wellington boot has now become a fashion icon. So it can be done for Wellington boots. I think another classic case in point is recently, and much closer to home, is the Ryanair repositioning. I'd argue that's more difficult than the Wellington boot campaign, but they're winning and they're getting their share price up, and it seems to suit everybody. And probably sort of another one which I think is probably a little closer home. If you remember from the MASH days, Radar was a nerd, and today I would say there's a sort of geek chic that has repositioned the nerd to something that's intensely desirable to become. And also I think parallel to that is that more seriously, and it wouldn't appeal to everybody here, but the repositioning of the American Army in the same period from the 70s to date has been phenomenal, in that they are people you've got to stop and congratulate every time you see them on the street in New York these days. So look, I mean, there are obvious reasons why this is a good thing and how it could be sold to people who can make more of an impact with their taxes. A euro of tax is undeniably a euro of tax. I think a job can be a good job, or it might be a not so good job. And the last thing I'd say is that I think we need to think that if we don't do something about getting the message of why tax is a good thing for corporates to pay and for high net worths and role models to pay, that other people will. The young people are being disruptive with technology, and they will find a way to get the information and publish it and profit from it. They've done it with taxis, which is inconceivable 5 years ago. They will do it with this information as well, Airbnb being another example. But I mean, on that point, I think, I've said much of this, but I mean, on that point, I think what I'm saying really is that it is easy to get the data, manage the data, distribute the data on, what happens to those taxes. That's the bit that's holding people back, but it'll only work, I suppose, if people want that to happen in the public service. And I'm encouraged to see that the civil service is examining itself. Last point for me, and I'm probably over time, is very quick one. I mean, topical water, CIE, and Aircom. I mean, it's been a bit of the interesting thing for this has been, for me, ignoring all the policies, ignoring all the crashing and hijacking and all that dreadful stuff. But the really interesting thing is that this process of moving a utility from the public to the semi-public has uncovered the cost of running that, and the cost of investing in that. That has been really interesting. So we can now quantify a core utility. And why is that really interesting? Because when we hear now, and I was interested that, you know, the CIE CEO, Dave Brennan, I think his name is, came out and said, this is a good time to start talking about I need more money for my utility. You know, with a very cursory glance, we were able to determine that that's not the full story. It's not just a subvention of 125, 50 million plus 100 million needed. It's actually, there's every other euro that's been paid to support what is clearly a non-functioning business. Now, you know, I'm sure there are marvelous arguments, and we'll hear them, about why it is that way. But the fact is, you know, you wouldn't in a commercial world invest 100 million a year in a business which is losing 135 million without taking some dramatic action. But it is a critical infrastructure, and that leads me to the last one, and this is absolutely 5 seconds, is we sold Aircom for 7 billion or more. We could buy it back for 3 billion and probably in better shape. And we would end up with a backbone and a core utility that could produce a return if we borrow that money in the market.